Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Nithya Subramanian, an editor at the Institute. Pakistan is in the midst of many political developments with protests by the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan against blasphemy in France. At the same time, the country has major stakes in the Afghan peace process, and recently both India and Pakistan announced a ceasefire at the LOC. To put all these into perspective, we have with us Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, a non-resident fellow at ISAS and an associate professor of political economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies, Quaid-i-Azam University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Aasim.
Thank you for having me.
We'll start by the latest developments in Pakistan. We've seen many protests by the TLP in the recent days, and these protests were followed by incidents of shooting, as well as hostage taking of police by the party. As we speak, we hear of news that the government will present a resolution to expel the French envoy. How do you think these developments will impact religious political groups in Pakistan, even though the government has said that the ban is not for any political reason? And what are your thoughts on this expulsion of the French envoy?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to be clear, I mean, the French envoy has not been expelled yet. This latest episode or confrontation, I think, for your listeners, it's important to bear in mind that this is a demand that this organization, the TLP, first put forward now some 6 months ago. I think it was in October or November of 2020. And there were, as has happened in the past, some years as well, different points in time, there was a French publication, a periodical, which published some cartoons which were perceived to be blasphemous, and that in France, and that then led to these protests and demands for, Pakistan to sever ties with France and expel the ambassador. That initial protest in November was then put off by the government by promising that, precisely actually that a resolution would be put to the National Assembly and then a decision would be made. And so, that whole series of events has sort of been delayed. And it was the deadline passed in February, at which point the government again asked for time. And then the incidents of the last few days, where the TLP then said, okay, well, you've repeatedly not fulfilled your commitment, and so we're going to march on Islamabad, etc., etc. And then there was arrests and a ban and so on and so forth. Now, in a sense, this is, I mean, certainly there's new elements or dimensions with regards to this particular organization, the TLP, because most of its backing is in Punjab, and it's a particular sect which we call the Brelvis. I won't get into that. Mostly, I think what is important to bear in mind is that there's this sort of a game of musical chairs that is reflected in this sort of situation, and that is that the religious right, as most even relatively uninformed sort of observers of Pakistan will testify to, has sort of been there and thereabouts, and various governments in at least for the last 20 years since what is called the War on Terror began. There's been this back and forth where sometimes the government clamps down on these religious right or these organizations, and then other times does deals with them, and so there's this on again, off again sort of relationship. And the TLP in this most recent episode is just in some sense another example of the same. And so your question of, well, what will be different, or what does this signify? In a sense, obviously we'll have to wait and see, but in a sense it doesn't signify much at all, because this has happened before, that a particular organization is banned or proscribed or clamped down upon, And then at a subsequent stage, whether it's that particular organization or another sect is sort of, tolerated or willfully supported by segments of the Pakistani state, and then the same situation repeats itself. They get, so to speak, too big for their boots, and then they have to be clamped down upon again, etc., etc. So, will the French ambassador be expelled? I would be very surprised, because, of course, that would be a massive diplomatic, would signal a massive diplomatic crisis. But is this the last of these sorts of episodes? I doubt that as well. I think this will happen again. The religious right has, in pockets, significant pockets of support in Pakistan, and governments and the state more generally has always towed a sort of, in some ways, ambiguous line towards them, and more generally, state ideology and the kinds of long-term, sort of political commitments that this state has made, or its priorities have always. There's religion and the sort of the politicization of religion has been part of Pakistan's story from the beginning. So I don't see this as the last episode of its kind. Unfortunately, I think there'll be more to come yet.
You said more to come yet. So do you mean that they would gain more political traction, because so far they haven't really entered the formal political space of government? So do you see the right-wing parties now playing a more not dominant, but significant role in the governance of Pakistan?
Well, I mean, that's it's not entirely correct to say that they've not been in government before. So the TLP, this particular organization, has had a very sudden rise to prominence. It only was formed in, I think, 2015, if I'm not wrong. And by 2018, the last time we had a general election in this country, it had, in terms of popular vote, I think it actually won something like the fifth or the sixth highest share of party votes. It didn't win many seats because of the first past the post system, but that's quite a meteoric rise. Now, this is one segment or one particular party, a religious party, which, as I mentioned briefly earlier, represents the Barelvi sect. Other religious parties, Deobandi parties, have had shares of government, again, in the past, whether it be the Jamiat Ulema Islam or the Jamaat-e-Islami, whether that these religious parties, whatever denomination we speak of, may never have enjoyed a sort of let's say the kind of or government in toto, like sort of winning an election per se, is of course a valid point. And I think that's an important thing to be reminded of, especially when Pakistan is depicted in blanket terms as sort of dominated by the religious right. In a sense, it isn't. It is, and it isn't. So the religious right has, I think, and overdetermines the public discourse. What can and cannot be said, taboos, social norms. Therefore, it creates. It sort of delimits what as I say, what you can do in politics. Religion is sort of a no-go area for everybody else but the right wing. But it hasn't always been able to translate that into, as you say, votes and winning an election. But the TLP, I think, is I wouldn't say it's a major break from the trend, but I think it is important to bear in mind that it has roots in the country's biggest province in terms of majority province with Punjab. And I think that's an important factor. And if last time's election result is anything to go by, there is a chance that it could make more inroads. But again, there's so many unknowns and so many shadowy parts of the story, including, as I said earlier, to what extent it will enjoy or not enjoy sort of patronage by the state, moving forward.
So we'll also move forward to Afghanistan, where Pakistan is expected to play a key role in the peace process after the American withdrawal. And now it almost seems certain that the Taliban will return to power. Do you think this would embolden such religious movements in Pakistan as well, as many share the same ideological mentorship?
Certainly. I mean, look, I think, as you say, it's not rocket science that 20 years, it'll be 20 years. Biden has announced that September 11th is when American troops will withdraw, or at least the final swathe of American troops will withdraw. So 20 years after Afghanistan was invaded and occupied, basically the whole exercise has proven to be basically pretty much a disaster show. There's no peace. The Taliban are still there. But for pockets like parts of Kabul, much of Afghanistan remains war torn, and there's strife, and it's heavily polarized. Yes, and the Taliban in Afghanistan have always there's been spillover effects in Pakistan. Not to mention, of course, which relates to the earlier point, that the widespread perception and that's not just perception. There's of course significant kernel of truth in that the Taliban, or at least what we call the Afghan Taliban, have always sort of enjoyed the support of Pakistan's strategists. So all of that does point to the fact that if and when in post America Afghanistan, the Taliban are front and center, if they're not unilaterally ruling the roost, then they have a big share of power that will and already has in Pakistan's border regions with Afghanistan. There are similar kinds of strife, militancy that have persisted throughout these past couple of decades. So it's not just because the Taliban would ostensibly be in government in come September 11th, but even prior to that, it's obvious. So certainly, yes. And this is what I was sort of hinting at earlier. There's different types of denominations and sects. So the Taliban are not Brelvis, not even close. But there is a certain synergy between all of these different sects. I mean, there's a lot of conflict as well, mind you, within Pakistani politics, between different sectarian sort of groups. But just to give you an example, the organization I was referring to earlier, the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Islam, headed by Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who is widely known to be very close to the Taliban, both within Pakistan and Afghanistan, despite the fact that he hails from a Deobandi sectarian background, in the last few days with the TLP fiasco, he has on more than one occasion very explicitly condemned the government for clamping down on the TLP and has said, we will support the TLP in its demands. So, despite all internal conflicts within the religious right, if there is a Taliban regime in power in Kabul and, domestically within Pakistan, different denominations, religious groups continue to be influential and enjoy some form of social support within society, and also, from time to time in different permutations are enjoying or are provided or patronized by our own establishment, then this is, as I said earlier, a story with no foreseeable end, and unfortunately a story that doesn't portend very well, both for the peace of Pakistan and for its 230 million people, nor for Afghanistan and its much longer history of troubles. So yeah, that certainly there's more to come with what follows the American exodus.
Turkey has emerged as an important player in the Afghan peace process, and it has also developed strong ties with Pakistan. Prime Minister Imran Khan and President Erdogan also share a special bond, and the two spoke ahead of the Turkey talks. Do you think this will complicate Pakistan's traditional reliance on Saudi Arabia and the UAE that are at loggerheads with Turkey?
I mean, of course, there's a lot of speculation involved. Will it or will it not? I think just to give some background, I think the Pakistani state historically um, has sort of tried to balance many different external patrons. So of course there's the Americans, and we haven't talked about it in this podcast, but there's the Chinese influence in Pakistan now. Then, as you just talked about, there's the Gulf states, the Saudis, and the UAE, the Emirates, and Turkey now. So, any one of these different sort of powers, for instance, let's just take the US and China, or as you just said, Turkey vis-a-vis the Gulf states, their own rivalries often do play out in a sense, not just in Pakistan, but also in Pakistan. So will it or will it not, with Pakistan's emergent relationship with Turkey, which, mind you, is not just started under the Imran Khan dispensation. Nawaz Sharif and the Muslim League Noon government was very close to Turkey and remains, I think, close to Turkey. So there's a longer trajectory of cooperation with the, well, at least the Turkey that we know under Erdogan, and the sort of the slightly more the Turkey with a more Islamist bent. And that has coexisted with the fact that Pakistan continues to have deep ties with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf states. And just to take an example, some of the recent parleys or sort of speculation of some lessening of tensions between Pakistan and India is widely reported to have been facilitated by the UAE. So, all of these foreign patrons, despite their rivalries and conflicts, the Pakistani state, in a sense, that's been in some ways its modus operandi right from the very beginning, from the time it came into existence. Whether it be during the Cold War or now, it does, and of course that's a very high stakes and risky business, because then sometimes regional and even superpower conflicts have spilled over into Pakistan itself. And that, in a sense, is what, all of these things we were discussing about the religious right. I think there is a long history, as everyone knows. What we know today as a religious right was of course heavily patronized by the Western world through the 1980s against the Soviet Union. So these are the sorts of, and not just the Western world, but as you say, also the Gulf states. So these are the sorts of, dynamics that we've always seen in Pakistan, more or less. And I don't think that ongoing cooperation with Turkey is going to hold Pakistan back from continuing to, for instance, we rely so much on oil imports on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. I don't think that's going to change, just to take an example. So I think these high stakes sort of encounters and parleys with foreign countries will continue, and also, as will the spillover effects of some of these rivalries that are actually not about Pakistan's people, but end up affecting Pakistan's people nonetheless.
While staying on the topic of Afghanistan, once the US troops withdraw, Pakistan will be pivoted to the center between United States and China. How do you think it will be able to navigate between the two to forward its own interests?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, there you go. That's what we were just talking about. I mean, it has navigated between the two. And of course, this is a long story. I mean, Pakistan has, since at least the 1960s, has cultivated ties with China, even as it was one of the frontline sort of states against communism in West Asia, in terms of and enjoyed a lot of US support and backing and military assistance, but that didn't stop it from also cultivating ties with China. So this, as I suggested earlier, this very high stakes, tension-ridden sort of balancing act is something that it's done with regards to the US and China for decades. And that's just come into focus now more because on the one hand, there was the Taliban and Afghanistan, the American occupation of that country, and Pakistan sort of at least on the surface and to a significant extent supporting that, even if also maintaining its own sort of strategic sort of interests there. And then on the other hand, there was around the same sort of in the same period, there's been China's influx into the region via the Belt and Road Initiative, and more specifically with the massive investment that we know as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And both of these things have been happening in parallel. And so, I mean, as I said earlier, I fully expect that will continue to be the case. There will continue to be efforts to manage both of these, superpower relationships. And what will come of it, it's hard to say, right? Like, I mean, I would be, on the one hand, one would expect that on both sides, at least on the superpower sides, the Chinese and the Americans both, even if there are tensions and there are sort of some proxy minor conflicts that play out, that there will be an avoidance of any major confrontation. And I suppose Pakistan is sort of a go-between in a sense. But as I say, it's very high stakes, and the kinds of fallouts that this country and this region, Afghanistan not least of all, has suffered due to whether it be the politicization of religion, militancy, and a whole other set of other sort of spillovers of these sort of strategic wranglings. It's hard to say, and even with CPEC, like there's constant concern and constant sort of reflection on the fact that in Balochistan, for instance, which is Pakistan's biggest province, there's been a low intensity insurgency going on for the best part of 20 years. So even where there are sort of at least claims that any form of patronage, whether it be from the Chinese or the Americans, are going to have long-term benefits for the Pakistani people, that then is also that's thrown into sharp relief by the fact that there is no peace, and there's many parts of this country and the region at large continue to be restive and conflict-ridden. And I don't foresee that this balancing act will necessarily be done in a way that's any better than we've seen it to date, which means, as I said, continuing fallouts. And that is what I meant by being high stakes, and perhaps strategic planners think that they're doing a good balancing act, keeping both sides of this superpower, both superpowers, sort of relatively placated. But whether or not that benefits our people is a different question entirely.
Yes, and finally, we'll have to talk about India and Pakistan. A ceasefire was announced across the LOC a few days ago. And soon after, Pakistan announced that it would resume trade with India, but later pulled back this decision by bringing Kashmir back into the discussion. And now, as we speak, the two foreign ministers, Dr. Jaishankar and Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, are both in the UAE. We haven't, of course, heard reports of any meeting. But what are your views on the current state of relations between the two neighbors? And do you think the UAE has played a role in this thaw?
Yeah, look, I said earlier, definitely that's what's been reported. I mean, of course, ordinary lay people like us can only ever just rely on what's reported. It's never these back channels. We never know more than what we see or is reported, but certainly reason to believe that the UAE or the Gulf would be interested, because as we know, we have, as we just talked about, long-standing relationships with Pakistan and a deepening, especially economic relationships with India, especially under Modi, So it wouldn't be surprising that the UAE would have brokered such talks. But certainly that these sorts of sort of so-called breakthroughs often do happen via third parties. The real question, of course, is whether on both sides of what the two protagonists themselves are actually willing to turn a corner. And if you look at like the lead up to what happened a couple of months ago, when there was this sort of sudden, almost dramatic, I think it was a writing of letters between Modi and Imran Khan around Pakistan's sort of 23rd March or something, if not before that. But prior to that, there's been all sorts of like verbal wrangling and frankly, just straight up, not language that you would sort of associate with a thaw. So the suddenness with which that has given way to slightly more circumspect sort of conversation, or at least exchanges, I think obviously sheds doubt on the long-term intentions on both sides. And the reality is, and you just mentioned about how for a few weeks it looked like there was a thaw, and then there was sort of this reiteration on the Pakistani side of the fact that the Kashmir cause, so to speak, can't be compromised. I mean, the reality is that whether it be talking about Kashmir on the Pakistani side, or even if you sort of think about the slightly more recent history of Indian politics and Balmama and the sort of Indian election. So on the Indian side too, there's both sides, play to a domestic gallery. And that domestic gallery, we talked about the religious right in Pakistan. So, in parallel in India, the religious right in India, which is of course one of Modi's major domestic constituencies. And so, yes, there's been a bit of a thaw in terms of the diplomatic language, but are those domestic compulsions no longer there? No, I think they are there for both of these regimes in place right now. And I don't see any fundamental shift away from that, sort of that larger, the social base that whether it be the Modi regime or the Imran Khan regime responds to. So, really the question is whether there are significant domestic constituencies for peace between the two sides. And that in the long run is what will be meaningful, not some sort of short-term UAE brokered, thaw, and that too, just a thaw in terms of the diplomatic language used for one another. Whether or not that actually translates into something meaningful, as you say, is something we'll have to wait and see when the two sides actually meet.
Thank you, Dr. Aasim, for this wonderful conversation. As usual, you were insightful, and it was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you for having me. The pleasure is mine.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. Also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you.